Today, I think we are going to experiment a bit on our hypothetical section. I
Yeah.
think thinking about great Western movies and the good, the bad, the ugly comes to mind. So we are going to talk about the good, the bad, the ugly of this mini dynasty that South African cricket had. What was the bad thing that it couldn't become like a full-fledged dynasty, and the ugly thing that it will not be probably replicated. So I think we'll go good by good, and I think I will pass it to you to just tell the first good part of this mini dynasty of South Africa.
Yeah, so one of the stories that you spoke of as Graham Smith batting with that broken hand, I think that symbolizes everything good about that South African team. An extremely strong leadership, that grit, resilience, and leading by example. Image of Graham Smith batting with that broken hand is so symbolic of what that South African team brought to every single test match or every single match for that matter across formats across the globe that they competed in, and that for me was the good of that South African team. What about you, SS?
For me, since you already touched upon the leadership, I will touch upon the other aspects of that team and the great all-round and capabilities that team had, and starts from their very strong school cricket system in South Africa. I think there is one particular school from which Kalis, ABD, and Faf have all come out. They used to play multi-sports. I mean, ABD is champion in all sports during his school groupings. They made athletes. Like India made cricketers, they made athletes, and they were so multifaceted. They have always been the benchmark of fitness and fielding excellence for good over 25 years. I mean, who can forget Jonty Rhodes as a testament of it? And I think that led them to be having an edge, which was unbeatable for a lot of teams, especially the Asian teams, I would feel. So much goodness when it came to capabilities, which allowed them to be fitter for a longer period of time, bowl with aggression, excellent in the field, and that amount of run saving that they would do would put pressure on a lot of opposition, not even in limited overs match, but also in test cricket. So I think this athletic capability, which allowed them to create really good cricketers and this golden generation, I think this stands out for me, which not a lot of teams would have, especially Asian teams.
Yeah, when you talk about fielding capabilities, the run out in the 92 World Cup that Jonty Rhodes impacted of Inzamam Mulak, I felt that single run out changed how people across the world saw fielding
And so many
as a skill set
all-rounders
in
as
cricket.
well. I mean, you had Lance Lusner, Brian McMillan, Hansi Cronje, Jack Callis, Sean Pollock. They always have good all-rounders. Even the bowlers will always smack some runs for you. So they always are able to find that 12th player composition. I mean, of course, Callis is the biggest example of it, but they would. I mean, even the lesser ones, Justin Kemp and all these guys, I mean, they always have it in them, which is like a big, I think, big plus to their team composition.
Yeah. Now let's move on to the bad SS. We discussed the good. Now moving on to the bad, what do you think was bad about this micro dynasty, and why we are talking about it as a micro dynasty and not as a full-fledged dynasty?
I mean, for me, it's a lack of a quality spinner. I mean, they've had decent spinners in the past, Pat Simcox, I remember Nicky Boye, Robin Peterson, but none of them will have the stats and none of them have the fear. Even when they were coming to India, okay, Paul Adams had some success in India, but even in this generation, you had some spinners like Paul Harris and all. These are spinners that can block runs from one side and let Steyn, Mockle, Philander, and Pandel attack. But again, that's not sustainable for continued success anywhere actually, especially in Asia, especially against India. And I think this is the biggest factor.
So, as on this podcast, we always like to reimagine cricket history. Now, my question to you is: what if South Africa had a world-class spinner? By world-class, I don't even mean Shane Warne or Muralidharan or Lion Ashwin level. I mean someone who is just effective. Say, for example, take Graham Swan or Monty Panesar. They played so much in the subcontinental conditions and they were fairly effective. So my question to you, SS, is what if the South African team had a spinner like Monty Panesar in their squad? How would things have been different for them?
It's a nice question. And Monty Panesar and Graham Smith in tandem did win a series in India before the New Zealand one. I mean, in those days, there were much more flatter wickets being made, not like the WTC wickets that made by India, which are lottery wickets, which Ajaz Patel could turn up and take wickets. So I don't think a super ordinary spinner will help South Africa. But if you get a Monty Panesar, a Graham Swan, even a Daniel Vittori for that matter, I think South Africa will win few more test matches. I think they would be much more consistent in Asia. And even in Sena conditions on day 4, day 5, you need that respite for a spinner to come in and do give some kind of variety. I think they would have won a series in India. And if they would have won that, that means they would have won series in England, and Australia away, and India away. That's, as we talked about in the previous episodes, that's tending towards a dynasty. So I think that would have
Yes.
made a big impact.
Plus, maybe it might have also reduced the workload of their pacers, Monty Morkel, Dale Steyn. We know about their injury concerns. Probably it would have helped there.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think we all agree to the fact that a quality spinner was a big miss for South Africa. But passing it over to you, what do you think was the bad part of their which they could not become a bad full-fledged dynasty?
Yeah, when I think about it, I feel they had so many superstars who were at the same time at the peak of their prowess. You have Jack Callis batting and bowling phenomenally well. ABD coming in, Hashim Amla at the peak of his form. Then you have ABD, Graham Smith, all of them coming at the peak of their form at the same around the same period. You also have Dale Steyn, Monty Morkel. So they were a team, I believe, who were built around these galactic superstars, very good cricketers who somehow came around the same period of time. So it was more around that, the stars aligned for them and they had a golden generation of players. They used that, they dominated world cricket. But the other factor which also helped them was that world cricket in general was in a flux. So you had Australian legends retiring, Glenn McGrath, Shane Warne, Ricky Ponting towards the fag end of his career. A lot of transition happening in the Australian team. In Indian team going through a lot of transitions, still finding their feet in world test cricket when it comes to at least the conversations around domination. England having their spike and then coming down after internal strifes. We know what happened with Kevin Peterson, Andy Flower there. So we know a lot of issues internally that England was having, and because of which they weren't able to dominate for a very long period of time either. And there comes the South African team backed by their golden generation, who then started dominating world cricket. They rose to the number one test rankings around 2012, if I'm not wrong, after defeating England in England. I think that was the match where Hashim Amla also scored a triple century. And then they were able to dominate the test cricket scene for a couple of years or so until 2014. And then, like Coach Shastri era was still a few years away. New Zealand was also going through a flux before they were stabilized under Kane Williamson later on. So a lot of flux going around the world cricket, stars aligning for the South African team, galactic superstars at the peak of their prowess around the same time. And that is what helped them take benefit of this. When I compare that to some of the other dynasties that we have spoken of, West Indies dynasty, that was a very conscious decision that, we want to dominate with pace. We want to strike fear in the minds of opposition. Similarly, Australian team was built around very strong leadership under Steve Waugh, and they had a certain brand of cricket that they wanted to play. They wanted to dominate not just on the field but also psychologically with all the sledging that went around. And I feel those were the kind of things which helped them sustain their dynasty status for a much longer period of time compared to this South African team. And that for me is the bad thing, that they weren't able to continue it because they were actually a golden generation for South Africa.
And I think also with West Indies and Australia, we talked about the replacements that were coming into the system were also like absolutely ready for Test cricket, and that helped them as well. I mean, West Indies, you had the fast bowlers coming through, so you have the brand of play decided by the top-down approach, and it has succeeded. But then you have the replacements coming to the system who can fit in very well and continue that success, which because of that golden generation thing, the replacements could not take up that, especially with the injuries that were coming to Steyn and Morkel. But because you mentioned about England, and England had that small, let's call it a micro dynasty when they won in India and Australia. If the fiasco around Peterson, Strauss, and Andy Flower hadn't happened, do you think that if England could have maintained their team and their team management, could they have posed a bigger threat, and how would South Africa would have coped with that?
I think that English side was pretty formidable in their own right. Alistair Cook, Andrew Strauss, we had Jimmy Anderson, Stuart Broad, Kevin Peterson, Ian Bell, so many really good players over there. And I feel if they didn't have the issues that they had, because they had just won a series in India, they had won a series down under in Australia, they would have been a really strong force in World Test cricket at that point of time. And probably today we would not have been talking about South African micro dynasty, we would have been talking about the English micro dynasty today. So very interesting to think about what could have been. And I do feel it would have been, it would not have been a South African dominance phase. It would have been more of a shared phase between England and South Africa at that point of time. Or probably knowing the inconsistencies that South Africa has been depicting throughout the years, it might actually have been an England dominated phase. Now with that, SS, I'm passing it back to you for the third part, which is what was the ugly part of the South African micro dynasty.
Yeah, maybe for this I pick up macro case. I mean, South Africa is a developing economy just like India, but unfortunately in cricket, India is very developed, but South Africa is not. They don't have the finances and everything. Strong domestic system, just similar to Australia, 6 teams, and you get the best players only playing for your nation, and that culminated into this golden generation that we talked about. But then you have something in parallel going around since the turn of the millennium, which was the coal pack system. Essentially, as a country, as a non-EU country, if you have a trade deal with the UK, your citizens could be treated as equivalent to EU citizens and can move to that country. And that's what happened. I mean, you had one shot players who were at the fag end of their careers taking up the coal pack deal, which was lucrative to play in the county, which is great for them because they've already served their part for South African cricket. But then you had really good players coming through South Africa's system who were not getting chances because of whether the quota rules or whether the big competition in South African cricket itself to get into the national team. They would take the offer of the coal pack deal and go to represent county and just turn down South African cricket. You lost a lot of cricketers like that. I mean, the biggest example, probably Neil Wagner went to New Zealand because he did not find opportunity. He took the non-call pack route. But then you had Kevin Peterson. Okay, he had a British passport through his mother, but still lost out in the system because he did play junior cricket there. Simon Harmer, we talked about spinners. Imagine if Simon Harmer played his entire career for South Africa. Excellent spinner, has such an amazing record in county cricket. They are still touting for him to come back somehow. And the Brexit deal has made it popular for players to return. And you can see it kind of coincides with South African cricket coming back into the form after doing the Devil's deal with BCCI around South African T20 as well. So I think Kolpak combined with the quota system led a lot of good players leave South Africa. So it was never meant to be a dynasty in the first place. It was a small culmination of golden generation of players coming together for a few years of time, peak of powers, and they succeeded because of it.
I love this point that you make, SS. It resonates on so many levels with how I think about the game. And I've also spoken so many times around the commercialization of the sport and the direction that commercialization and success of the teams follows. And I definitely feel South Africa has also been, in that ways, a country impacted by the commercialization part of it. Definitely the economy not doing well, Kolpak impacting them. But my question again on the what if terms is what if Brexit say happened 10 years back? We got to talk about these things.
Or the trade deal that was never in place, because if even if Brexit happened or not happened, if the trade deal between South Africa and UK wasn't there, then none of this call back system would have existed. But either the trade deal or the Brexit, if happened earlier, I mean, you wouldn't have this dynasty because I think some of the players would have left. I mean, you saw example of Kyle Abbott. He was the best performing ODI fast bowler before the 2015 World Cup. In semi-finals, they picked half-pick Vernon Philander. He did play a couple of test matches in 16, but then left the country in the right at the middle of his prowess. So it might have tilted the heads of a few players as well. If Brexit would have happened earlier, they would have remained in the system. Much more competitive test match team. It would help them to remain dominant for a couple of more years down the line, especially if Abbott would have gone, Simon Harmer wouldn't have gone. That would have been great for them, I think. But on the other side, you can also look at flip. Sometimes people will not take the callback deal, but would, because of this freedom of movement, they will play county cricket, learn from them, and return back to the system. So it had advantages, pros and cons. But I think if, especially Abbott and Harmer and Riley Russo, I think I remember these three guys leaving, and I think if they wouldn't have left, maybe for a couple of years, South Africa would have continued. But I think because the systemic issue, the quota system, some players would leave just because of that. And I think that would have been very difficult to live away with. So maybe a couple of years of extension, I would say, but not much. But now to you, what's your ugly story about South African cricket? Why it's not a dynasty?
Yeah, whenever we speak about South African cricket and their dominance, we also have to speak about the choke job that they always pull up. Not wanting to take a below the belt shot at the South African team, but then that is something which I feel is a mental block in their own psyches. We have seen that time and again. We spoke about the moments which come to mind when we think about the South African team. I still remember ABD crying after that World Cup 2015 semi-exit. Steyn has himself admitted that he has never been the same bowler after that World Cup exit. And I think although test matches didn't have an ICC tournament or a World Test Championship back then, but then the impact that all the other ICC events have had on these players' psyche, I think they were mentally burnt out after a certain point of time. And this has also shown up in their performances, even in Test cricket. So I think that for me has to be one of the ugly parts of South African cricket, that they have been there very close to that finishing line, and time and again they have not been able to cross that, and that's a mental block that
Maybe if
has
Steyn
burnt
and
them out.
ABD, maybe if Steyn and ABD won an IPL with RCB, that would have been really helpful. But speaking of ICC events, I think they were quite in the semi-finals of the 14 T20 World Cup that happened in India, and Kohli versus Steyn, I remember that, and also the 15 World Cup semi-final. If somehow things would have fallen in their favor, if they would have won, do you think that the dynasty would have like upgraded from, let's say, a mini dynasty to a fuller dynasty? What do you think?
Yeah, I can only imagine what would have happened if Dale Steyn was steaming in to bowl for another couple of years. But I also feel, given the injury concerns, but still, I feel that South Africa would have been more competitive for at least a couple of more years. If they were able to win that 2015 World Cup, it would have given them such a strong fillip in the entire cricketing ecosystem that they have
Correct.
in South Africa.
That's a good point.
More, we have seen that happen with India, right? 1983 World Cup, that is such a turning point, not just in the playing 11 that plays for India, but also what happens at the grassroots levels in the Indian domestic system. A similar thing happening with the 2011 World Cup. So we know that these ICC events can have such a huge fillip in how the cricket evolves in a particular country, and a country like South Africa, which has always had deserted history when it comes to championship wins. So I do feel that it would have given them such a strong fillip, and probably, if not at that point of time, they would have maybe built up a dynasty right now with a lot of superstars coming up, Kolpak, Brexit basically happening, a lot of their superstars coming back into the South African system. So I think it would have definitely had a huge impact on their team.